Welcome to the inaugural episode of SPRingBoard, presented by Saif Padgett and Rizal, where we explore the critical intersections of law, policy, and the environment. Today, we are honored to be joined by two accomplished voices in environmental law and advocacy, Professor Michael Gerrard and Kate Sinding Daly. Michael Gerrard is a trailblazer in the field, serving as the founder and faculty director of the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law at Columbia Law School. He is widely regarded as one of the nation's foremost environmental lawyers, with a career spanning decades of groundbreaking litigation, advocacy, and scholarship. Professor Gerrard's contributions include authoring or editing 14 influential books on environmental law and climate change, including Global Climate Change and U.S. Law, as well as advising governments and organizations worldwide. He has taught and lectured across the globe, shaping legal strategies to address some of the most pressing environmental challenges of our time. Kate Sinding Daly is the Senior Vice President for Law and Policy at the Conservation Law Foundation, where she has led efforts to craft innovative solutions at the intersection of environmental and human health. Her career reflects a profound commitment to equity and sustainability, including her tenure as the inaugural executive director of the North Light Foundation and nearly a decade at the Natural Resources Defense Council. We are particularly excited to have Kate join us today, as she was previously a partner at Saif Padgett and Rizal. Together, Professor Gerrard and Kate embody the power of legal ingenuity and advocacy in driving environmental progress. In today's conversation, we'll explore the anticipated changes in environmental law and policy under Donald Trump's second presidency. The conversation explores the differences between the Trump and Biden administrations, the role of the EPA, state responses to federal policies, and the impact on environmental justice communities. Welcome, Professor Michael Gerrard and Kate Sinding Daly, to the inaugural episode of SPRingBoard. Before we dive in, I want to note something for our listeners. I refer to Professor Gerrard as Professor Gerrard and not Mike or Michael because I was a student of his at Columbia Law School. It's not that he insists on the title, it's just that after 3 years of law school, I still don't feel that I've quite earned the right to call him by his first name. Some old habits die hard, I guess. With that, we are very excited to welcome Professor Gerrard and Kate to SPRingBoard. So let's get into it. By the time this episode airs, Donald J. Trump will have been sworn in for his second term, presumably initiating the series of actions he promised for his first day and his first 100 days in office. While his previous term offers us some insight into his approach and priorities, how do you anticipate his second presidency will materially differ in practice? Kate, let's start with your thoughts.
I think the most significant difference this time is that whether or not he was actually surprised to win last time, he certainly wasn't prepared to occupy the office on day one. And that's very different this time. He's been in the role before. He's got a huge number of people who've been around him for the past 4 years, plotting what they would like to do with a second administration. And so I do anticipate that we will see them hit the ground running on day one. In fact, although this episode is airing at the inauguration, it's clear that they haven't waited for the inauguration to put some of their plans into practice. And so I do expect a flurry of executive orders will be forthcoming. And in more general terms, expect that his appointees, those who are confirmed and those who don't require confirmation, will have a playbook and a plan of action, and will begin executing on that rather immediately.
Professor Gerrard?
I agree with that. I think that in general, his appointees are chosen primarily for their allegiance to Trump as opposed to their substantive expertise. And so a lot of them don't go in with as much knowledge of the particular agency that they're about to run, but even greater commitment to upholding the pledges of President Trump. So I think that will be one difference. One big question is, will they proceed so hastily that they'll not follow the necessary administrative procedures? One of the big problems they had the first term is that they tried to bull through with a lot of actions without observing the requirements of the Administrative Procedure Act and other laws, and many courts struck that down. They may be more careful this time, although it may be that they'll be less patient. So we'll have to see how this plays out.
Kate, you mentioned that the administration has not and will not wait until day one. What are some of those actions that we're already seeing being put into motion?
This is not specific to the environment, but I think the one that's most notable to me is the approach that they're taking to the media, which will, of course, have implications for our society at large, and including all of the issues that Professor Gerrard and I work on and that you work on at Saif Padgett and Rizal. We've already seen a settlement from ABC News over a lawsuit that apparently has emboldened a second lawsuit against the Des Moines Register and is manifesting itself in a chilling of the media even before the administration has assumed office. And that is a profoundly significant change in our society that I don't think we can either overestimate or pretend to understand, because we frankly haven't seen it in this country. So that would be one that I would name.
I assume that Trump is going to immediately revoke just about all of the executive orders that were issued by Biden, just as the first time he immediately revoked Obama's executive orders and Biden revoked Trump's. So we go back and forth on this. Trump executive orders can be issued and revoked with the stroke of a pen. So there are going to be a lot of pen strokes coming out. Regulations take longer.
Yes, absolutely. And you mentioned the revoking of any executive orders. Let's dive a little bit deeper into some of the contrasts between the Biden and Trump approaches to environmental law. In what areas do you expect the differences between the Biden era and Trump era environmental law to be the most pronounced?
Climate change. Trump has historically been a climate change denier, and his entire philosophy is drill, baby, drill. So he's already said that he's going to do everything he can to accelerate fossil fuel extraction and use. Now, I don't think he'll be able to do nearly as much of that as he intends to, and we can talk about that. But clearly his attitude toward climate change and his attitude toward fossil fuels are 180 degrees away from Biden's.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do agree that the impacts of the real world impacts versus the rhetoric, there hopefully will be daylight there for a whole variety of reasons that, we can get into. Another one that I would identify is the commitment to Justice 40. I think that is likely to be one that is, if not revoked in terms of the executive order, something that will be targeted through other ways in which EPA will pull back on environmental justice and climate justice commitments. And so that would be another, I think, one that's probably in the crosshairs.
And I'll go further, and I'll suggest that he probably will revoke environmental justice executive orders, and any consideration or discussion of environmental justice or racial equity or anything along those lines as part of the administration. And I think he'll affirmatively tell the government not to think about any of those issues.
Absolutely. I mean, we saw that during his first administration. Environmental justice was wiped from the EPA website as a term and an office. So that's something that I think, at least I anticipate happening again. And I wonder how you think details like that will see differ in terms of how the Trump EPA versus the Biden EPA understand what their role is in the administration. How do you think, based off your conversations with people that you know who work in EPA, or just based off of what we saw during the previous Trump administration, that the priorities are really going to shift, and how the EPA itself as an agency is going to view itself in the larger administration?
I think that the mandate that Lee Zeldin, the incoming EPA administrator, has been given is clearly deregulation, that they're going to do everything they can to wipe out or weaken the regulations that are on the books, and almost certainly to reduce enforcement of the regulations that remain. So they're not going to be writing any new environmentally positive regulations, and they're going to be working on trying to revoke the old ones. One irony here is that in order to revoke a regulation, you need a new regulation. You need to go back through the same notice and comment process, and you need to clearly explain why you're changing your mind. You can't just say, well, we had a new election and we're going in the opposite direction. The courts have been very clear that if there's a change in an administration policy, it has to be clearly explained. Now, we know that Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy in the Orwellian-named Department of Government Efficiency want to slash and burn lots of agencies, and there's talk about moving EPA headquarters to Florida or Texas. We don't know if that'll happen, but they're going to need a lot of staff to actually change these regulations in a way that will survive the inevitable lawsuits, and it's going to be real hard to do that if they have slashed the agency's staff. You no longer have people around who can do that.
I believe that Trump has been throwing around that 100,000 number in terms of jobs in Washington that he's looking to cut. And we've seen in the past, during his last administration, he attempted to cut a significant number of government jobs and moved, I believe it was BLM, the Bureau of Land Management's office, out to Colorado, a small town in Colorado, and 3 employees made the move, and it was just devastating. So if that were to happen again, we can only imagine how catastrophic those effects would be.
Yeah, I completely agree with what Mike said. I think there is a tension between, I think their fundamental approach is going to be that they're an agency in service of industry as opposed to in service of public health and the public. And that is going to result in them making the regulatory regime as business friendly as they can. But there is a tension, as Mike points out, between slashing staff and doing that. One overlaying concern, however, is the extent to which, with the Supreme Court at the of course apex, but the federal courts in general becoming more conservative, they've got an ally to some extent in the courts, and they've been very deft at choosing jurisdictions that result in rulings that are either teed up to go to the Supreme Court or that, in their immediate effect, support an anti-regulatory agenda.
And ironically, it may not be as industry-friendly as they think, because industry also relies on getting permits.
Mm-hmm.
And getting permits for your industrial operations requires permit writers, requires people in the agencies who are going to do the work to issue the permits. And if we don't have those people either, they're not going to be able to issue the permits, and industries won't be able to operate. Or when they're seeking permit modifications or delisting of various chemicals, lots of things that require staff to meet the desires of industry. So some of this is going to go in the opposite direction of what they intend.
I do want to I don't want this to be all doom and gloom, if at all possible. So I do think it is possible that there are some areas that are so broadly popular with the public, and where even somebody like a Lee Zeldin doesn't, has a record of having some concerns. And I would highlight drinking water and PFAS as being one of those. I think it is possible that there may be opportunities sort of in a nonpartisan way to advance some protections.
Yeah, one area that was relatively untouched under the first administration was hazardous waste regulation. So the Superfund law and the Resource Conservation and Recovery law were not really targets very much. Now on PFAS, on these forever chemicals, I'm not as sure that they will be immune, because there's a lot of industry pressure growing on those specific rules. And EPA recently listed a couple of the there are several thousand of these chemicals, but it listed a couple of them as hazardous substances under the Superfund law, which means that there would be investigation of a lot of contaminated sites to see whether they have those particular chemicals, and if they do, have to clean them up. And it's also imposing some pretty serious requirements on drinking water supplies. So I think there certainly will be pushback on those rules. We'll see how that turns out. I mean, Lee Zeldin, when he was in Congress, although he had only a 14% score in the League of Conservation Voters ranking, was, as a congressman from Long Island, very concerned about about water on Long Island and coastal conditions and so forth. So he doesn't go in philosophically, personally opposed to clean water by any means, but we'll see what directions he gets from the White House and how much he toes the line. The early indications are that he's pretty much a line tower, but we'll see how that turns out.
We'll definitely be keeping our eyes on PFAS here in the office. I know that Project 2025 has a section in there that speaks to precisely what you were talking about, Professor Gerrard, taking a second look at the listings of PFAS under CERCLA. So we'll see what happens with that. But before we continue to dive into looking forward, I would like us to take some time to reflect on what was going on in the environmental law sector during the Biden administration. So can both of you speak a little bit to what was prioritized by EPA and what was deprioritized under the Biden administration in the environmental sector?
Clearly, climate change was very high on their list, and they issued a whole series of regulations on that. But of course, their signal accomplishment was the Inflation Reduction Act, which was enacted kind of surprisingly, but it got through with not a single Republican vote in either the House or the Senate. The Inflation Reduction Act was the single most important piece of legislation that Congress has ever enacted related to climate change. Now, that in itself is not saying a whole lot because there hadn't been much on that area, but it's really significant, the amount of money that it was designed to pour into clean energy projects, which is the core of what we need to do to address climate change. Now, of course, the Trump administration is going to try to undo some of that, but I think it's clear that work on climate change was something that the administration said was an all-of-government activity, that it was not just EPA, but it was actually agencies throughout the federal government that really worked to focus on climate change. That became the subject of a lot of attacks from the other side, but that was, I would say, that was one of their two major focuses. The other major focus is what Kate just talked about, environmental justice. That also was a major focus of the Biden administration, and it will very clearly not be a major focus of the Trump administration.
Can you talk a little bit about Justice 40 in your response?
Yeah, so
Thanks.
so just so everybody knows, Justice 40 really stands for a policy under which 40% of the benefits of any policies that address climate change are to accrue to historically disadvantaged and marginalized communities, which is a very significant commitment that was made by the Biden administration very early on. And so not only did you see the adoption of that as policy, which then, obviously had to be realized through regulatory processes, and we can talk about that, but you saw staffing decisions that were made to reflect that as well in the Council on Environmental Quality and in EPA. And so, really a demonstrable commitment to recognizing that certain communities, environmental justice communities, which are largely communities of color and low-income communities, have borne the disproportionate brunt of impacts from our industrialization, and that not only does that practice need to be addressed and stopped moving forward, but that there should be a form of reparations, and that benefits from the transition to a clean energy economy should be prioritized to flow to those communities. That being said, I think it's a mixed record. I am not an environmental justice practitioner myself, and I wouldn't pretend to speak for the environmental justice community. But there certainly is, I think, there are some mixed feelings about the daylight to some extent between some of the aspirations and early commitments and what actually has been realized on the ground. And one area in particular that I think many environmental justice advocates feel that not enough progress was made on under the Biden administration is in the area of what we frequently refer to as cumulative impact. So looking kind of holistically at addressing as the name suggests, the aggregated impacts of multiple pollutants within environmental justice communities, and adopting a regulatory strategy to address that that cumulative impact.
One thing I wanted to know if either of you could speak on, I know you noted that you're not an EJ practitioner, but using environmental justice as an example, when we shift from an administration that puts an emphasis on providing funding to environmental justice groups to one that removes even mention of the word, what does that look like for those communities on the ground? I know that when the Biden administration came in and was preparing to provide funding, there was still a difficulty to get that money to the communities because they were coming from having completely removed that infrastructure, and trying to coordinate and get the money into the right hands was difficult, even under an administration that was prioritizing those efforts. So what does that seesawing of where prioritizing, where not acknowledging, what does that look like actually practically on the ground?
Yeah, it's a really important question. And I do want to say that I think EPA has worked incredibly hard. They still are, because they're still there, and they're still moving as much of the IRA money as they possibly can before the end of the Biden administration. Has worked really hard to both wrap their arms around the extent of the problem that you just defined about how to move money into communities that might, because of the historical disinvestment, lack in the infrastructure to be able to receive vast sums of money and be able not only to receive it, but then to comply with it, what are rightly or for good, I would say for good intentioned reasons, very rigorous, reporting and compliance requirements to obviously, avoid fraud and so on. I think they did a lot to really try to establish an infrastructure to be able to move that money, and in fact have moved a lot of the money. A huge concern is what you're alluding to. What happens when money does move into communities and then that tap gets turned off, and how much harm is effectuated not only in the communities, but to, a lot of the organizations that were the ones that, raised their hands to help move that money from the federal government down to the ground, and have hired a lot of people and built up a lot of infrastructure to do that. I think that is a significant concern about the about face that we're likely to see here.
I mean, I think one of the big fights we're going to see in the weeks to come is that between Election Day and Inauguration Day, the Biden administration worked very hard to get as much money out the door as possible. The question is, did it get as far out the door as you need in order to prevent it from being clawed back? Because I think the Trump administration is going to try to stop the spigot and maybe bring some of the money back. So I think we're going to see a lot of fights along those lines. The various degrees of commitment that you have before the check is actually written, and even after the check is actually written. So I think that's going to be a big source of dispute in the weeks and months to come. And these community groups, as Kate mentioned, that receive the money are going to need help in the inevitable litigation that will arise during these efforts by the new administration to get some of that money back.
Completely agree. And I do want to name drop, just because it also relates to what we're talking about. There is an organization called the Environmental Protection Network that emerged in the first Trump administration, where you saw a real exodus of folks from EPA who did not feel that they could serve in that administration, but also recognized that the loss of institutional knowledge, the brain drain from the industry would do really significant harm to communities across the country, and did great work in the first administration to provide advice to communities and to organizations about how to navigate EPA, and then sort of transitioned into being very effective in doing that with and helping organizations and communities access monies from the IRA, and I think are now very well positioned to help do some of that defense that Mike's just alluded to.
And
but
will no doubt grow.
Yeah, right. With the new fleeing EPA, refugees,
Thank you both for those insights. We've spent some time talking about federal environmental policies and the potential shifts, but as we all know, federal actions are only part of the picture. State governments play a pivotal role in shaping environmental outcomes, especially when we see shifts in federal policies. With that in mind, how do you anticipate states will respond to the second Trump presidency? In what ways specifically do you see more progressive states perhaps taking on a more active role in addressing environmental concerns and climate change? And from some of the less progressive states, what may we need to anticipate?
Well, certainly during the first Trump administration, a lot of states took major actions to move forward. New York State adopted the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. California strengthened its laws. Several other states strengthened their environmental laws and their clean energy laws, and I certainly anticipate that the same thing will happen this time around. One of the challenges, of course, is that New York, for instance, adopted a very strong climate law. Now they have to implement that strong climate law. So on the books is a solid statute, but there are really challenges in implementing that solid statute. New York City adopted some very strong laws on moving away from natural gas to cleaner sources of energy. Implementation of that is a challenge. So many of the states do have strong environmental laws on the books. I think we will see more of those, but actually implementing them is going to be an ongoing effort. And regardless of who's in the White House, that's going to be an important role for the states. I also expect that the states will continue their practice of challenging in court most of the actions of the Trump administration when they become ripe. Governor Newsom of California just announced a $25 million fund to bring lawsuits against the Trump administration.
I hadn't heard about that.
Yeah. I think we'll see a lot of that. I think that the Attorney General's offices in New York and California and Massachusetts and the other blue states are gearing up for the onslaught of litigation that is coming.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. But I also think, just as you can't speak as anything and as a monolith, you can't in this case. So, so I work now for a regional organization that's centered on New England. And even within New England, where we've got 5 of 6 states that have adopted very strong climate laws, we've got largely pro-environment administrations in a majority of the states. And we're certainly going to be leaning very hard on our elected officials in those states to not only hold the line, but to drive significant progress on climate so that we, the we're all in states can still show up in the international community, demonstrating that no matter what's happening at the federal level, progress is being made. We're going to see real differences across the states. Vermont, little Vermont, but it's a moniker is brave little state for a good reason. It's often at the forefront of adopting some of the most progressive measures. Lost their Democratic supermajorities in both houses of the legislature. Have a moderate Republican governor, but one who's very concerned about the cost implications of implementing their climate law, and is going to have some struggles holding the line in terms of making the progress they've been making. So we'll see. I do think it's absolutely critical that those blue states that can be leadership states lean into that as strongly as they possibly can, and that also includes those who have progressive attorneys general playing defense. But it will be a mixed bag across the country, I'm sure.
And I think it's also worth pointing out the important role that cities will play. And not only cities in blue states, but cities in red states where you have sort of blue islands within the state. So I think of Atlanta, Dallas, Austin, various other cities. And so cities play the central role, for instance, in building design and energy efficiency, green buildings, that kind of thing. There are some limitations on their ability to ban natural gas, but leaving that aside, they have considerable autonomy. They set the transportation patterns, and the biggest sources of greenhouse gases we have, our transportation and buildings are two of the biggest sources, and cities play a major role there. And I think that we have a lot of cities that are really geared up to want to act aggressively on climate change.
That's great to hear. There was a lot of optimism in both of your answers there, and I feel there is always a bright light when we're talking about the work of cities and states, because there are so many people who are looking towards trying to reach some of these goals that the states have set out related to climate change, and there's so much great work that's being done on that level. So it's nice to hear that you're both optimistic that that will continue.
And to offer just one more bit of optimism, even, we didn't really talk as much about red states, but the reality is that the vast majority of IRA dollars have gone to red states and have resulted in investments now that are bearing fruit in terms of job creation on the ground in clean energy technologies. And that is not something that folks are going to want to give up. And you're already seeing Republican lawmakers from states that have been significant recipients of those funds saying, let's take a little bit of a go slow approach to clawing back the IRA. Maybe we don't have to throw out the baby with the bathwater, and maybe there are parts of this that we want to keep. It's the same thing as with the Affordable Care Act. Once something is out there and it's starting to demonstrate its value and have demonstrable impact in people's lives, it's much harder to claw back on ideological lines. And I think, that's true of the IRA. And I think that will filter down into state policy in some red states, particularly as relates to clean energy technology. So I know we will definitely see significant attacks on climate progress in some sectors and in some states, but there's a momentum behind the clean energy transition that is, sort of baked in, and that is, I think going to be supported by market forces and things that won't be as readily susceptible to ideological opposition.
I certainly agree with that. And as Kate said, the bulk of the money for the IRA is designated to go to the red states. Now, however, most of it has not yet been generating the large number of jobs. And I think for that reason, it's one reason why the IRA didn't seem to change many votes in the red states. It took a while, just as with the Affordable Care Act, it took a while for people actually on the ground to be seeing the benefits of it. But in the coming months or years, unless the Trump administration is really very successful in stopping all of that, we're going to see a lot of jobs in the red states, and that may have an impact. The clean energy economy has been growing rapidly. I think it'll continue to grow even more rapidly. It's one of the most exciting things happening in the U.S. economy, and it's going to be a major driver of jobs.
I want to, in the interest of time, ensure that we have the opportunity to discuss a few other sectors, because these impacts will be far-reaching. Another key player in this environmental law regulatory landscape is the private sector, which doesn't always move in lockstep with federal policy. So how do you anticipate the private sector will respond to this new regulatory or deregulatory environment, and what can we expect to see?
Well, one thing that the private sector certainly wants more than almost everything else is predictability and consistency. And I think there are a lot of people and companies who are really flummoxed by what's going to happen. They spend a lot of money complying with regulations. They're okay with that, particularly if their competitors also have to comply with the regulations. But if there's a lot of uncertainty about just what rules they have to apply to, it causes real difficulties. And that will lead to inhibition on capital expenditures. That if there's a regulation that requires you to spend $1 billion on certain kinds of pollution control, but you're not sure if that regulation is going to stick, you're going to be reluctant to actually commit that money. So I think you'll see different companies behaving differently. There will be some companies that are very public-facing that will care a lot about their image and their ability to portray themselves as environmentally sound. There are other highly polluting companies that are not public facing, such as the petrochemical companies that make the components that go into plastic. and nobody knows what their names are. And so they don't care so much about their public image, and they may take greater advantage of loosening of enforcement and so forth than some of the public-facing companies.
Yeah, I certainly agree that it's going to be sort of a hodgepodge. It's going to really depend on the industry, and to some extent, depending on the nature of the industry, different players within it. I am a little bit concerned that there's already been a pretty significant erosion of companies' concern around their environmental bona fides because of concerted attacks from the right on so-called woke capitalism, and on ESG investing. That said, when you look at polling, and companies certainly do, or public sentiment, companies certainly do, the public still does care about a lot of these issues. So it'll be sort of interesting to see how much of a factor that is. But at the end of the day, the most significant factor is going to be the bottom line, right? And so it's going to be, as Mike said, those who have made major investments based on a particular regulatory forecasting or outlook are not going to want to have stranded assets, and are going to be looking to be able to make good on those investments. And those who see an opportunity to save money by a lesser regulatory environment are going to push for increased deregulation.
Thanks for both of those responses. So we've touched on quite a few different players at home and how they may respond. But of course, the impact of U.S. environmental policy goes far beyond that. Can we take some time to talk about, if Trump withdraws from the Paris Agreement again, how do you see that affecting global climate goals? And what do you anticipate those ripple effects might be here in the U.S. and around the world?
Well, the U.S. Lost its credibility in the international climate community the first round, and really ceded leadership mostly to China. China is by far the world's leader in building out wind and solar and electric vehicles and nuclear. They dominate most of the clean energy supply chains. They're also still building coal plants, so it's a problem. But they're really dominating, and the tariffs that Trump is talking about imposing will actually increase that domination, by meaning that the other countries are going to be relying less on the U.S. I think that the withdrawal of the U.S. from Paris did not lead any other countries to withdraw from Paris, which was kind of a surprise, and it may not again this time, but it does embolden politicians in some of those countries to say, if the U.S., which is historically the world's largest polluter and the richest country, is not taking actions, why should we make sacrifices? I think of a country like Indonesia, which is a very large, very populous country with a lot of emissions, but much poorer than the U.S. And if you're a politician in Indonesia, well, it's hard for you to justify spending extra money on climate change if the U.S. isn't doing that. So I think that will be one very unfortunate ripple effect.
Yeah. And I'll just circle back to one of the things we were talking about earlier, which is, again, why it is so important that the states that have the political wherewithal to do so continue to act as aggressively as they possibly can to make progress on climate. Because I don't think saying, X number of states are continuing to act is going to be as effective in convincing in Indonesia to make progress as having the U.S. And the federal government involved will. But it has a significant impact on the kinds of market forces that I think make it easier to bring other countries along in terms of taking action on climate. And so that's just going to be essential that we not cede progress where we can get it over the next 4 years.
As we enter the final minutes of today's episode, I'd like to ask each of you for a final thought. So please let our listeners know, what are you most excited about in the realm of environmental law over the next 4 years and beyond? And can you tell us a little bit about what you're working on?
One of the things that we're doing a lot of work on in our region is offshore wind. It's going to be the single most important contributor to decarbonizing the economy in New England, and we have tremendous potential for wind off of New England's coast in the Gulf of Maine and down through really into the mid-Atlantic. And we're starting to see these new farms, offshore wind farms, come online and start generating offshore wind energy in the region. I don't want to. I guess I have to acknowledge that wind is one of the things that Trump has specifically called out as something that he wants to kill. That he wants to kill on day one. He's accused of driving whales crazy, and all sorts of other things. And so I think it's one of those sectors that is certainly going to be potentially under attack in a new administration. But it's also one where I think we have the potential to demonstrate that there's a certain momentum and forward progress that is going to make, the rollbacks that he's promised or the elimination of the industry that he's promised impossible. So I guess to the extent one can get excited about, entering into that battle, that's something that I'm excited about.
Yeah, I agree. I think the build out of clean energy is one of the most exciting things. And Kate is right that offshore wind is especially vulnerable to federal interference because it's all in federal waters. Onshore mostly is not, except if it's on federal land. And so we're going to see huge growth of wind farms and solar farms and very remarkable technology developments with storage, geothermal, various other areas. I think we'll see a lot more of that. I think that's a real growth area. I'm certainly seeing in my students a great deal of interest in that as they think about their careers and what can they do for the next 20, 30, 40 years. I think that clean energy technologies have a tremendous potential.
And if I could just actually piggyback quickly on that, because that's, of course, true. One of the areas where I think that there's a risk, but therefore also an opportunity to really accelerate clean energy development is in the area of AI and data centers. So, we're obviously very concerned that there's a lot of talk about even reopening coal-fired power plants, but less short of that, expanding gas, maybe looking to nuclear. But I think there is an opportunity, again, in the right states to really mount a concerted campaign that new energy need needs to be met through renewable energy. And again, I'm excited to take that campaign on.
Kate, you might have just determined our next podcast episode with that comment. I mean, AI is everywhere right now, but the environmental impacts are something we certainly need to be looking at sooner rather than later. 100-word email is a bottle of water used. I mean, those types of headlines are hard to ignore. So we may be seeing you back for another episode soon as you take on that charge. We've come up against our time. Kate, Professor Gerrard, thank you both so much for sharing your thoughts and your insights and helping us navigate what lies ahead. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us for the inaugural episode of SPRingBoard. We hope this first episode gave you a glimpse into what you can expect from this show. This was SPRingBoard. Stay tuned for future episodes where we'll continue exploring the intersections of law, policy, and the environment. And remember, every springboard is a leap towards something greater. Until next time, take care.